the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. We'll be picking up in just a moment. Acts chapter 9. Before we get started in Acts chapter 9, we want to look at our outline that we've been following. In 1 through 12 of the book of Acts, we've divided the book into two sections. 1 to 12 is the gospel in Palestine, and in 13 through 28 is the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world. We're still in section 1, and we're still dealing with the gospel in Palestine. It's not until chapter 13 when we begin the first of the preaching journeys of Paul that the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world there in chapter 13. So we're still here in section 1 of the gospel in Palestine. We've also said that there are 6 progress reports that we want to look at as we go through. Each of these sections conclude with a report of how the gospel is spreading. We're going to pick up in verse 31 of chapter 9 this evening. That's the end of progress report number 2, panel number 2. They span 1 through 6:7, 6:8 through 9:31. This third panel is going to start at 9:32 and go through 12:24. So we'll try to remind ourselves as we get to the chapter that the end of each of these panels is at, of these panels and these progress reports. So we're going to see that here in verse 31 in just a moment, panel 2. We've been over the last couple of studies in the book of Acts. It's about the conversion of Saul. This chapter than just the conversion of Saul. We'll see that here in just a moment. But that's sort of the main part of the chapter is dealing with the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, a former persecutor of the church. 1 to 9 was where the Lord appeared to him on the road to Damascus. Right inside of the screen, that red arrow is pointing to Damascus. That is where Saul was going at the time, where he had letters to take and to cast men and women who were serving Christ into prison. In 1 to 9, Saul's on the road to Damascus and to persecute Christians, but in 3 to 6, that's 1 and 2 of that section. In 3 to 6, the Lord appears to Saul. The light shines around him. He hears a voice from heaven saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The Lord identifies himself to Saul there in verse 5. In verse 6, he tells him to go into the city, and there he will hear what he must do to be saved. And in 7 to 9, Saul goes to Damascus. 10 to 12 was the conversion of, or 22 is the conversion of Saul. And 10 through 18a is where the Lord sends Ananias to Saul. The Lord comes to Ananias and says, "You need to go into to the city." Tells him where to go to find Saul of Tarsus. You remember Ananias first is sort of hesitant. He says, that he knows who this man is and all these things that have taken place. But the Lord told him that he'd be a chosen vessel to go before the Gentiles. And so Ananias goes, and he tells Saul what he must do to be saved. And then in 18, the latter half of verse 18, Saul immediately after the scales fell from his eyes and he regained his sight, arose and was baptized. And then we find him preaching Christ and associating with those who are practicing the truth in the end of 19 and then 20 through 22. Section 3 was Saul going to Jerusalem, 23 through 30. We talked about that on Sunday morning. First, there was a plot in 23 through 25 that he escaped to kill him. In 26 through 28, he joins himself to the disciples in Jerusalem, seeks to join them, and then eventually he has to leave there, and he departs to Tarsus after more opposition comes. In that section, we went through on Sunday morning, we made the point of a couple of things important we learned. First and foremost, Saul sought to join the church that was at Jerusalem. He found a church that was standing for the truth and then sought to identify with that church to become a part of that local work. And so one, when they're moving to an area, is going to try to find a local congregation, or should try to find a local congregation, rather, that is going to stand for the truth and seek to join themselves to it. And in the church, in this case, as we pointed out in our questions on page 58, about the practice here that we see from the church, is that a church has a right, and not just a right, I would argue a responsibility, to ask questions of one who's seeking to place membership, because they want to make sure, and we see here from Acts 9 that this is what needs to be done, make sure that that one is a faithful servant of God. And So that's what they did here when they had their questions about Saul of Tarsus. Is he really faithful? And so they asked some questions. And then eventually Barnabas vouched for him, and he became part of the church there at Jerusalem. Verse 31 now, section 4, that's where we're picking up. Verse 31. So the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace and was being built up. And walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. Four things pointed out here in verse 31 about the churches in Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. They're doing well. Again, this is the conclusion of panel number 2. This is our conclusion of our second major progress report. Again, we've had some progress reports that happen. We'll get to chapter 10. What significant event takes place in chapter 10? When we get there in a moment. All right. First Gentile convert, Cornelius obeys the gospel. Do we have some progress report there? Yeah, the Gentiles obey. We have some progress being made that we can read. But I'm talking sort of bigger progress reports of what are taking place, not just a few here and a few there. It gives a sort of bigger picture at the end of these 6 panels. The bigger picture here, those in Judea and Galilee and Samaria. Now, I want to go back to our outline for a minute that we're following. Not for the chapter, the outline of the book. It's got 2 sections. Gospel in Palestine, 1 to 12. Gospel to the ends of the world, 13 through 28. But we subdivided that down, the first one, in the Gospel in Palestine, into 2 major sections. 1 to 7 is the Gospel in where? In 1 to 7. It's in Jerusalem. And then 8 through 12 is the Gospel in Judea and Samaria. So we have Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. That all region right there, that Palestine region, right, is where the gospel has been spread so far. It's going to go to the ends of the world beginning in chapter 13. Now, obviously, there are some that have obeyed the gospel outside of that main region, those that may have come in and learned the truth. But in terms of where you're seeing the most growth, we're seeing it in Palestine, right? That's where the church is sort of focused right now until the preaching journeys of Paul in chapter 13. So here we are, seeing these churches in this area, Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, where we have this concentration of those that have obeyed the gospel. There's 4 things about them. They have peace. Okay, they have peace. Things about having peace. First of all, they can have peace at this point, possibly from the persecution. Who was one of the greatest persecutors at this point? Saul. Where's Saul now? He's in Jerusalem and he's obeying the truth and preaching the truth, right? Now, obviously, there are more in opposition, but it seems that one of the ringleaders there was Saul of Tarsus. But I think aside from the fact that they may have some peace from persecution for now, because that's going to pick up again, right? Chapter 12, when we have James put to death and Peter looks like he's about to put to death, we're going to have more persecution from coming later on. But right now there seems to be peace. But even if it's not outward peace, what do they have? What do they have that's by far more important? Peace with.
The peace that passes all understanding. That inner peace.
Yes, the peace that passes all understanding. They've got peace with God, right? Keep your finger at Acts 9, but if you would turn to 2 Peter chapter 3, I want you to think about a passage here, and in 2 Peter chapter 3, when somebody read for us verse 14 of 2 Peter 3.
Therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent, be bound by him to keep without all person.
Okay, so in 2 Peter 3, 2 Peter 3, 11 through 18 is about what manner of persons ought we to be. 2 Peter 3 is dealing with the second coming. That's what the chapter is dealing with. 1 through 7, there are some that deny it. 8 through 10, it is certain. 11 through 18, here's how you live in light of its certainty. Verse 11, therefore all these things should be dissolved. What sort of people ought we to be in holy conduct and godliness? So he's listing what you need to be. You could begin back in verse 11. You've got to be a holy people. You've got to be a godly people. You've got to be people looking for the coming of the day of the Lord, 12, 13, and 14. And then in verse 14, you're found without spot and blemish, and you're found by Him in peace. Okay, so here are people that have peace. At this point, those that are serving Him faithfully, those who we read here at these churches, they don't have to worry about punishment as long as they continue on this path. And they have peace within, knowing that no matter what happens, even if persecution picks back up, and even if their life is taken from them, They have that peace and they have a home with God in heaven. Now, not only do they have peace, they were being built up, the text says, or edified. So, not only, not only do we have people that are living in peace, we have people here in verse 31 that are being edified by the teaching that's being done. They're being built up. They're being strengthened, right, by the things that are being taught. Isn't that part of the work of the church? When we talk about the church, what are the three things we list? The church is to engage in limited benevolence, edification, and then evangelism or preaching to the lost. So those are the three things. The church here, they're being built up, right? They're being edified. People are being encouraged by what's going on. Not only are they being edified, they're people that are walking in fear and comfort. In verse 31, it's important that they're walking in the fear of the Lord, because about some of the other passages, even in chapter 10, when we get into chapter 10 in a moment, we'll get this far this evening, but all the way down in verse 34, Peter reaches the conclusion in his sermon that God shows no partiality, that whoever what? Verse 34 of Acts chapter 10. Whoever, verse 34 and 35, but in every nation, anyone who fears him. That's important. When Solomon comes to the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes, I believe Ecclesiastes, just as a side note, is written at the end of Solomon's life. I think that's the indication. It seems to be that perhaps, though we can't say for certainty, it's written after it takes place in 1 Kings chapter 11, where his heart is drawn away, and now, perhaps all too near the end, he finally realizes, as he's tried everything, that truthfully what makes man happy is verse 13, chapter 12, verse 13. The conclusion of the matter, all has been heard, what? Fear God and keep His commandments. So that's the conclusion he reached. That's the whole duty of man. Or again, you've heard me say it before, that word duty is added by translators. Better translated, fear God and keep His commandments. This is the whole of man. That is, this is what makes man whole. This is what makes man happy, complete, is fearing God and keeping His commandments. You think about the Old Testament. What does the Lord require of you? One of the things listed there is to fear Him. Right? So fear is an important aspect. We've talked about it before. There are two aspects of fear. There's reverence and respect, and there's being afraid. I think there's probably part of both here as they're walking in the fear of the Lord. They're afraid of displeasing Him, but they also have a reverence and respect for God, for the sacrifice of His Son, and what He has done for them, that causes them to walk in fear. And because of that fear, they have comfort in the Holy Spirit, because here are people that are living a righteous life. And then finally, they are multiplied. The church continues to grow. It doesn't stop its growth here, but even in the midst of this, the church continues growing. Yes?
I think it's important here, too, that you notice about Samaria, because the Jews would have absolutely nothing to do with the Samaritans. So now these same Jews, the ones that have obeyed the gospel, now they're treating the Samaritans and giving them the gospel. And it's like, I'm sure they were the same way with Saul. I don't believe this guy. This is the guy that want to kill us. Now we got a bunch of Jews that want to talk to us. So that makes it pretty important for the Samaritans.
Yes, and I think that shows too their reaction, not just in the response of people like Saul, but in other things. It shows the power of the gospel in their attitude towards them, that now here are those that were once hated, and even later on with the acceptance of the Gentiles, though some didn't fully accept them and said they needed to be circumcised. With those that did accept them, it shows the power of the gospel, that when those that are serving God faithfully, serve Him in the relationship they have, that they're able to set their differences aside and realize that as long as they're living within the confines of God's Word, that's what's most important. Now, that's the churches, or our progress report. They had peace, they're edified, fear and comfort, and they're multiplied. Let's talk about the two miracles by Peter. We won't spend a great deal of time here. A couple of things we need to hit real quick. There's two miracles that take place here. But a couple of very important lessons. We're going to read through both of these, and then want to hit some of these important lessons here in just a moment. Now, as Peter went here and there among them all, he came down to the saints who lived at Lydda. And he found a man named Aeneas, bedridden for 8 years, and was paralyzed. But Peter said to Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Rise and make your bed. And immediately he rose. And all the residents of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, please come to us without delay. So Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. A couple of very important things we need to understand. Question 10 in our book, how do the miracles recorded here? We've talked about this with the miracle back in chapter 3. Question 10, how do the miracles recorded here in this chapter differ from the miracles we hear about, these modern day miracles, the miracles we hear claimed to be worked today? How do they differ? It's immediate. So there's an immediate healing that takes place. It was evident. So it's immediate. It's evident. There's one more thing about the second miracle that we don't see today. And that is, what's the second miracle? Tabitha was raised from the dead. So you'll see miracles today. Let's go back to the first miracle for just a second. Okay. Here in the first miracle, we have a man bedridden for 8 years. So here's this paralyzed man, bedridden for 8 years, who's healed. And mentioned it's immediate, and it's an evident fact that it takes place. Right? Nobody can deny that this man has been healed. He's been bedridden for 8 years, and now he's walking around. Same thing we talked about back in chapter 3 with the healing of the lame man there. That man had been lame for since birth. He was over 40 years old. Here's a man that's no longer lame. And even the leader said, the fact that a miracle's been done, we can't deny, right? Because it's evident to everybody. So those two things are already different. It's immediate and it's evident. Another one here. It's immediate, it's evident, it's complete. Okay, you may see somebody today, or hear somebody say that they saw a healing take place, and so we've got this paralyzed man up here, and he's in a wheelchair, and he can't get up and walk on his own. But we say we've healed him, and now we're going to get him up, and we say he's healed, but then we have to lift him on both sides and stand on both sides because he can't support himself. Right? That's not complete. That man's not really healed, which we know that, but we talked about the ceasing of spiritual gifts, which would include those miracles on Sunday morning. But, excuse me, aside from that, that's not complete and evident. But even those that may claim, they may say, hey, we're going to heal this paralyzed man. We're going to heal this person over here. Now, we can see that clearly that didn't fully take place, or there may be some questions about whether the person may have been paralyzed. They hopped up real quick. But you know what you do not see in any of these? You don't see him trying to raise somebody from the dead. You want to prove to me that you can work miracles? Take somebody that's been dead for several days and then raise them from the dead. Right? That's going to be proof that this person's really working a miracle. But guess what? It can't be done. Right? That's important to understand here about these miracles, though. Going back into chapter 8, just a chapter earlier, one of our converts we talked about, one of those progress reports we talked about, was the conversion of one Simon the sorcerer, who did all these great acts and deceived people. Now, I don't know what all acts he was doing to deceive people. I know it was obviously impressive to the people that they listened and followed him. But going back to that, there was some deception going on, right? You may watch somebody try to do a magic show or a magic trick. They're going to guess your card or something. And what it all is some sleight of hand to where they can do it to where uh, it's impressive that they learned how to do that without you being able to know that they did it, but there's no magic really involved, right? It's all deception. Now, we said going back to that, and this is why there's a difference. No matter what Simon was trying to do, Simon wasn't doing things like this. And that's why when Philip came along, the Samaritans who were enamored with what all Simon was doing are now following Philip and what he's teaching. And then Simon over here, who's been faking this all along, now realizes this is some true power. Why is it they realize it's true? Well, because of some of the things like this, where a lame man or a paralyzed man all of a sudden is up and walking after being paralyzed and bedridden for 8 years. Or a woman that's been dead for a couple of days is now standing and walking out of the room, and it was clear that she was dead. This isn't one of those where somebody didn't get a pulse and they just weren't feeling correctly, and then she stood up 10 minutes later, and then you realize, oh, she was just sleeping and her pulse must have been kind of slow. No, she was dead. And then a miracle takes place because she's raised from the dead. Yes.
Sometimes it pays me to step back and think that this wasn't isolated. Later on, we get there, we'll see Paul the Ephesus. They practiced curious arts. We know it was Ephesus, and they burned their books. They set value to these things they weren't isolated. Then you really go back and look at the days of Moses, whenever they went in to show Pharaoh those things to kind of show the power of God. They're magicians or whatever. They were trying to seem like this has been something people's been fascinated with almost from the beginning, at least back to the days of Moses. And like I said, when Paul goes over into Macedonia, different places, he's going to see that this type of thing, like I said, it was just everywhere he went. I mean, was saturated with this thing. So sometimes when we see that, we might think, or for me, anyways, I think, these miracles, why didn't they really have the effect that they should have had? Well, if you look at it from the standpoint, there were people that were pretty good at deception. We looked at Simon the sorcerer. It wasn't just the dummies. It said he was fooling people from the least to the greatest. So obviously they were pretty good at this deception. Like I said, in a broader sense, this permeated pretty well the whole known world back at that time.
It did. It was like you brought up Ephesus in chapter 18. I think it is later on, or 19 when we get later on in the book. In 19, I think it is, when we have the riot there taking place later in the book, where the people are burning those books of sorcery and things like that. So you're right, it is a commonplace, and it probably is a hindrance to some. And then I think for some, on the flip side of that, who were able to sort of see through it, that's what makes them sort of swing the other way with the truth. Is some of them will realize, yeah, this is impressive, but it's kind of like we said, I can do a card trick and show you how to. I can't do it, but if I could learn how to do a card trick and then get the correct card based on how you put it back in and everything, right? And then you're like, oh well, is this your card? Yes, but it's all a sleight of hand and a trick. It's something I learned. It's not real magic. But there are some that probably saw right through that, and then when they see these miracles taking place on the flip side, while some may not have had the same effect, some of them I think it had the opposite effect, because now this isn't that sleight of hand that Simon tried to pull on us, or this isn't the hand that others pulled. So I think it had probably two extreme effects, one on either side, to certain people, the ones that may have seen through those things.
It also jumps out today that, Peter, we know that he denied the Savior, he denied three times for the rooster. But because of his penitent heart, God was still able to use him. And I think there's a lesson for us today. Not that we want to, premeditate sin and do those things or whatever like that. But I've fallen short before. But when I do, I go back with that fortified right spirit and get my life right back with God. He can use me again. Because if I'd have been in Peter's case, I must have thought, hey, there's these other men, these other 11. Surely there's something, he's one of the more, like I said, I could be he's one of the more prominent men. So, like I said, that's the God we serve. We want to go ahead and sin so the grace may abound. That's not my point. But when we do fall short, if we come back to God and Lord, he used, Peter raising Tabitha, raising Dorcas. That wasn't any small thing, So like I said, that just jumps out at me that God can forgive.
Absolutely. No, I think that is a very important lesson for us to learn, not just in his case, but the conversion of Saul of Tarsus as well, who refers to later, as Paul refers to himself as the chief of sinners. Yes.
I think we also have to remember that when we're reading the Bible, that you can just be 10 verses down, but there's a whole long period of time between it, between the verses. Now, these men, the way this is written, it looks like Tabitha's already dead, and they're going to get Peter. That shows their faith, and they said he was the job, and they say that the church is strength, but it shows the faith that they had. That, and it wasn't like they saw it on the news.
Right.
Hey, he's out there. So it shows the faith.
Yes, it does show the faith. And to your point about how much time passes, I think sometimes sometimes we turn through pages and we turn page after page after page after page, and we're actually in a short time frame. We do that. This Leviticus, what is it? I think a year and a half, something like that. There's not a long time frame that they're actually, or 6 months that they're at the foot of Sinai. You turn page after page after page of the law, and you have very little time passed. Then all of a sudden you get to Deuteronomy and you turn page after page after page, and 40 years have passed. And when you go through here, it wasn't all that long ago we were at the establishment of the church in Acts 2. I believe it's somewhere around 10 years has passed at this point, from Acts 2 to Acts 10. We're now at about 43, which is why the church grew. Now, it's still very impressive that the church grew so much in 10 years, right? Because they didn't have the technology today where you could post sermons online and you could fly across to a place. But I say, quite a bit of time passes, and sometimes you realize that you're right, and that's something we have to realize. Like here, where a couple of days had passed, it seems that by the time they come and they go get Peter, or even in the next chapter, we hear Cornelius come, and then they go to Peter, and they get Peter in chapter 10, and then they stay the night, and they go to the household of Cornelius. You think, what has this been, 12, 13 hours? No. 4 days ago I saw, and immediately I sent. There's a great deal of time that passes by in that time frame. Let's get ready to get in the beginning of Acts chapter 10. We won't spend a great deal of time here this evening, but we want to go ahead and get started in our time remaining in Acts chapter 10. Real quick, look here. See if I can get it to zoom in. Well, that's the wrong button. Well, if I could hit the right one, it would really help. All right, well, that's not going to work. Coming down here at the bottom of your screen, this sort of blue arrow, this is where Peter's journeying. So he's been at Jerusalem. He came to Lydda here. This is where the first miracle takes place. Joppa is where he raises, he's going to raise Tabitha from the dead takes place. And then he's going to go on up here to the top of this arrow here to Caesarea. And I don't even know why I try this thing because it's not working right. Right here, this is where we're going to end up with the household of Cornelius here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and look at our outline. Well, I don't know why that's the same outline. There we go. I copied something wrong. We've got the main Cornelius. God brings Cornelius and Peter together. Peter's sermon taking place here. Those are our three main sections. Let's talk about the man Cornelius. It'll probably be as far as we get this evening. We'll go ahead and list those there, and then we'll read verses 1 and 2, and then we'll skip down to verse 22. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of what was known as the Italian cohort, a devout man who feared God with all his household, gave alms generously to the people, and prayed continually to God. Skip down to verse 22 again. We'll come back and fill the rest of this in later. Right now we just want to see the description of this man Cornelius because there's something important we're going to have to understand here in a moment. They say Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by an holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say. Now, here's the description given here of this man Cornelius. We know he's a centurion of the Italian regiment or cohort, verse 1, but here are the qualities of him described. According to verse 2, he's a devout man. He's a man that fears God, verse 2, verse 22. A man who gives alms generously, verse 2, who prays always, who is just, and is of a good reputation. Okay, that's the description of Cornelius. Now, I want you to forget for just a second what's fixing to take place. I'm going to come back to that in a second. If I was to give you this description right here of somebody, how would you describe them?
Well, the world would say, that's a good man. He's going to heaven. No.
They'll say it's a good man that's going to heaven. How else would you describe this man? He's devout. He fears God. He gives alms generously. He's always praying. He's just, and he's of good report.
Verse 30 says he fasted also. That's something that's common, so he prayed, he gave alms, but he fasted too.
Yes, verse 30, he fasts. So you would think, okay, here's the work of God. How would the world, besides the fact that he's going to heaven, how would the world describe him? What word would they use to describe him without anything else? He's a saint, or he's a Christian. That's the term you're going to hear used, right? I think something we have to understand. The world uses obviously that term very loosely. I think sometimes among brethren, sometimes we use the term Christian too loosely, and sometimes we use it to describe somebody like this. For example, we sometimes talk about we need to go back to being more. What kind of nation? How do you often hear it described? Godly or Christian nation. When was this nation ever a Christian nation? In terms of the majority of people being Christians, New Testament Christians? Never. Okay. Were there some biblical principles that were founded on some things and some people that were trying to do that were religiously wrong, that were trying? Yes, but and things were different back then. But there was never a time where we were more where there were more people, or the majority of people that were New Testament Christians. So loosely, sometimes you hear about somebody, that's a good man. The first thing they're going to say is, I've read it sometimes. I like sports. I'll watch sometimes, and I'll look somebody up online, and it always fascinates me how so-and-so is a good Christian man who's been arrested 3 times and has 8 kids by 7 different women. He's a good Christian man. Or you flip through and you hear, he's a good Christian man, and then you watch an interview on television, and you're going to have to mute it because of some of the language. That's a good Christian man. Why? Because there's somebody that talks about God. If you're going to interview him after the game, and you're going to say, what do you want to do? The first words out of their mouth are, I want to thank God, right? And so everybody says, that's a good Christian person, a good Christian man. No, Christian is a person that practices and does what the Bible says. Cornelius is a good man. Cornelius is a very good man. There are lessons that every Christian could learn from Cornelius. Cornelius, at 1 through 2, until the end of the chapter, he's very Cornelius, not a Christian. Yes.
I was thinking there back in John chapter 9, verse 31, and it was the man that preached to John. He said, now we know that God is not your sinner, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. So Cornelius was still a sinner at this time. He was a sinner with a lot of good qualities, but the fact that he was seeking. So as we harmonize these scriptures, if I willingly persist in sin, if we're going to see the word willing here in 47, 48, they were commanded to be baptized. If he would have rejected that, there would have been no more hearing. But the fact that Cornelius was seeking after God, that's how I think we can harmonize these scriptures. Somebody that persists in sin will have nothing to do with God. Proverbs chapter 1 talks about these people that disdain, they reject God's word. He said, then later on, fear and terror and calamity come to me. He said, then they'll follow me, and I will not hear. So I guess we got to harmonize.
Right, and we'll talk more about that in some detail on Sunday morning because that question does get asked. If Cornelius wasn't a Christian, why did God hear him? Right, and we'll talk more about that. Yes.
This is an excellent example too of people that say, just ask God into their heart. Pray. Along with Saul, I told the lady recently, I said, if anybody could have been saved, Saul prayed for 3 days, but he was still told what to do, and Ananias told him what to do.
Right.
Here, Peter's going to do it.
Right, and they're people that want to do what's right, but he's a good man, and he hasn't made that decision to serve God just yet. He has to do what the rest of us have to do. There is no partiality. We'll pick up in verse 3 beginning with God bringing Cornelius and Peter together. Talk about that vision and more on Sunday morning.